Chris Botha, the doorbell, more and the oil maya. At first, it looked like the kind of missing person story that makes a neighborhood hold its breath. A pregnant woman was gone. Her 2 young daughters were gone. The house was quiet in a way that did not fit the morning. There were phones, messages, friends calling, a front door that would not open, and one husband standing in the middle of it all, trying to explain why the people closest to him had suddenly vanished. The first version sounded simple enough to repeat. Maybe Shannon Watts had gone somewhere. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe she needed space. Maybe the girls were with her. In the opening hours of a case, people reach for the least terrifying explanation first, because the other possibilities are too heavy to say out loud. That is where this story begins, with a version that could survive for a few hours, but not for long. What made the Watts case different was not one dramatic clue. It was the way ordinary objects began to push back: a doorbell camera, a neighbor's security system, a truck in the driveway before sunrise, a phone left behind, a house that felt staged, and still an interview that sounded less like a plea and more like a performance. The case did not collapse because someone found a single magic answer. It collapsed because too many small facts lined up in the wrong direction. Before the oil site, before the courtroom, before the guilty plea, there was the house on Saratoga Trail. It was the kind of house that looked built for family photographs and quiet routines. From the outside, nothing about it announced danger. That is part of why the case is still so disturbing. The setting was not an alley, a motel, or some remote location. It was a suburban home, a garage, a front porch, and a morning that should have been ordinary. On the 13th of August 2018, Shannon Watts was expected to be reachable. She had returned to Colorado after a work trip. Friends were used to hearing from her. She was active, responsive, and connected. When messages went unanswered and appointments were missed, the concern did not start as television drama. It started the way real panic often starts, with someone who knows the missing person well enough to understand that silence is not normal. The friend who sounded the alarm at the house was Nicole Atkinson. She had dropped Shannon off earlier, and when Shannon could not be reached, Atkinson came back to the home. Instead of accepting the silence as normal, she called. She waited. She pushed for someone to check inside. What she found was not an answer, but the beginning of pressure. In the first hours of a missing person case, that kind of pressure can be the difference between a story cooling down and a story being forced into the open. Pressure is important in this case. It is not just police pressure. It is social pressure, camera pressure, timeline pressure, and the pressure of a story being tested against the real world. Chris Watts returned to the house while officers and friends were already concerned. From that moment, every movement began to matter. A casual answer was no longer casual. A pause was no longer just a pause. A detail that might have passed unnoticed in another house suddenly had weight. The early body Henry footage from the welfare check has a strange tension because everyone is still operating inside uncertainty. People are not screaming accusations. They are trying to find the simplest explanation. Is Shannon inside? Did she leave? Where are the girls? Why is her phone here? Why are the car seats here? Why would a pregnant mother leave without the things she would obviously need? The questions are basic, and that is why they are so damaging. In a true crime story, viewers often expect the shocking evidence to arrive like a thunderclap. This case is colder than that. The first cracks come from practical objects: a purse, a phone, medication, a vehicle, chilled seats. So items that did not fit the idea of a voluntary disappearance. These things do not speak, but they make certain explanations harder to keep saying with a straight face. Then there was the neighbor's footage. The camera did not show everything, but it showed enough to change the atmosphere. It placed a truck at the house during a critical window. It showed movement before sunrise. It gave investigators and viewers something more solid than a husband's words. The footage did not solve the case by itself. It did something more subtle and in some ways more powerful, and made the private mourning visible. A doorbell camera and a neighbor's security system are ordinary now. They are part of the background of modern neighborhoods. But in this case, those devices became witnesses. They did not understand motive. They did not know the family. They did not care who looked sympathetic on television. They only preserved a fragment of time. And once that fragment existed, Chris Watts had to explain himself inside it. Watch the psychology of that moment carefully. A person can tell a story in open space, but a camera narrows the room. When the neighbor plays the footage, the mood changes. The easy narrative starts to feel smaller. The truck is there. The timing is there. The absence is there. What had sounded like a missing family concern begins to feel like a timeline problem. The porch interview made that feeling worse. Chris Watts stood outside the home and spoke to reporters as if he were a husband hoping for his family to come back. He used the language people expect in a missing person case. He asked for them to return. He said the house was not complete, but the performance had a thinness to it. Viewers later rotate his face, his hands, his tone, and the strange gap between the words and the situation. It is important not to pretend that body language alone solves cases. It does not. People grieve differently. Check can make someone look cold, scattered, or unreal. But when odd behavior meets hard evidence, the behavior takes on a different meaning. The porch interview matters because it sits beside the timeline, the missing items, the camera footage, and the decisions Chris Wattis made before anyone knew the full truth. At this stage, investigators were still building a picture. They were not just asking what happened after Shannon came home. They were asking what each person could prove, what each device recorded, and what each claimed movement meant. The story had to survive the house, the phone, the truck, the neighbor camera, and the later interview room. It did not survive them. The interview room is where many cases change shape. It is quiet by design. A table, a chair, a recorder, fluorescent light. No dramatic sound rack. No audience, no place to hide inside a public statement. In that room, a story has to repeat itself cleanly. If it shifts too much, the shift becomes the evidence. If it becomes too convenient, the convenience becomes visible. Chris Roy was not facing one single contradiction. He was facing a pattern. The family was missing, but the house held belongings that should have left with them. There was surveillance that did not support the clean version. There were friends whose concerns started quickly because Shannon's silence was out of character. There was a work location that would later become central. And there was the emotional reality that the first explanation had begun to fail. The oil site enters the case like a second setting in a nightmare. It pulls the story out of the neighborhood and into an industrial landscape. Tanks, roads, open fields, metal dust, and a kind of distance that feels designed to erase human life. The contrast is part of the horror. The case begins in a family home and ends up tied to a work site, a place that should have belonged to routine labor, not a national crime story. Survey 319 became one of the names attached to the case. For viewers, the oil site is not just a location. It is the moment the story stops being a missing person mystery and becomes something much darker. Investigators did not have to rely only on emotion or suspicion. The physical geography of the case began to matter. Where the truck went, what time it left, what the workday looked like, and why that location could not be ignored. This is why the Watts case is often remembered through images rather than only through courtroom language. A garage in the early morning, a truck backed into a driveway, a neighbor watching security footage, a porch interview, an interview room. Oil tanks under a Colorado sky. Each image is simple. None of them needs decoration. Together, they create a sequence that is difficult to forget. The public learned pieces of the case quickly, but investigators had to move carefully. A missing person case can become a homicide investigation before the public understands why police have to test stories, preserve evidence, and avoid being pulled too far by emotion. That discipline matters here because the case was emotionally explosive from the start. A pregnant woman and 2 children were gone. The public wanted answers. The evidence needed time. When Chris Watts eventually confessed in stages, the shifting explanations did not bring peace. They brought a different kind of disturbance. Each new version raised questions about what had been hidden, what had been minimized, and why the earliest public words had sounded the way they did. A confession can end a search, but it does not always end the story. Sometimes it begins the argument over how the story could ever have been told differently. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty. He received multiple life sentences legally that closed the central question of responsibility. But the case did not leave public memory because the evidence carried a rare quality. It made deception visible in ordinary places. People were not only horrified by the crime, they were horrified by how close the first version came to sounding plausible. That is one reason the doorbell camera matters so much. It is not a zenematic clue in the old sense. It does not chase anyone. It does not confront anyone. It simply exists. It records the edge of a morning, and that edge becomes a trap for a lie. A modern camera can turn a driveway into a timeline. It can turn a neighbor's living room into an evidence room. It can make a casual explanation feel suddenly impossible. The phone evidence works in a similar way. Phones carry the weight of our routines. When someone who normally responds suddenly stops, the absence becomes information. When messages remain unanswered, when location and behavior do not match, when the phone itself is still present, the silence becomes louder. In this case, the technology did not make the story less human. It made the human choices harder to hide. A strong true crime case is not strong because it has the most shocking images. It is strong because every scene changes the meaning of the scene before it. The friend at the door changes the meaning of the quiet house. The quiet house changes the meaning of the porch interview. The neighbor footage changes the meaning of the truck. The oil site changes the meaning of the workday. The plea changes the meaning of the performance. That is why this episode has to slow down on the timeline, not to stretch the story, but because the timeline is a story. If Shannon simply left, the objects in the house should have made sense. If the girls were safe somewhere else, the silence should have made sense. If Bruce Watts was only a frightened husband, the interview and the evidence should have moved in the same direction. They did not. The most unsettling part of the case may be how normal the background looks. The streetlights, the garage door, the kitchen counter, the porch, the work truck, the neighbor's television. The case does not ask viewers to imagine evil in a place designed to look evil. It asks them to look at spaces built for ordinary family life and accept that something unthinkable passed through them before sunrise. There is another layer here, the public performance of innocence. Not every guilty person gives an interview. Not every suspect steps onto a porch and speaks into cameras. That decision gave the public a record to replay. It also created a kind of moral whiplash. The words were about concern and return. The reality already closing in was about concealment and consequence. But the case should not be reduced to a single awkward interview that would make it too simple. The truth emerged because people acted quickly, because evidence was preserved, because cameras recorded fragments, because investigators kept testing the story, and because the physical trail did not match the emotional script being offered. A case is rarely broken by one thing. It is broken by pressure applied from every side. A friend who raised the alarm deserves attention for that reason. The early hours of a missing person case can decide whether evidence cools or stays warm. Concern that looks pushy in the moment can later look life-saving. Atkinson did not solve the case, but her urgency prevented the silence from stretching comfortably. She forced the house to be checked. She forced questions into the morning. The neighbor's role matters for the same reason. It is easy, after a case becomes famous, to treat every piece of evidence as inevitable. It was not inevitable. Sam had a camera, and Sam reviewed footage. Sam noticed that the movements did not feel right. That is how a modern neighborhood can become part of an investigation without intending to. Ordinary vigilance became part of the record. The oil site, by contrast, represents isolation. It is where the story tried to leave the neighborhood behind: wide fields, tanks, equipment, distance. If the house is a place where the first story was performed, the work site is a place where the story ran out of cover. The physical world did not cooperate with the lie. He kept a location, a route, and a sequence that investigators could follow. In the courtroom phase, the tone changes again. Courtrooms convert horror into procedure. Charges, pleas, sentencing, victim statements, custody, life sentences. The language is formal because it has to be. But formality does not erase the emotional weight. It only gives society a way to respond without becoming as chaotic as the crime itself. Chris Wake's guilty plea spared a long trial, but it did not spare the public from the details already known. The plea fixed a legal outcome, yet the case remained culturally alive because the evidence was so visual. People could picture the driveway. They could picture the neighbor's screen. They could picture the porch interview. They could picture the tanks. That visual memory is part of why the case keeps returning in Dickinson and Tomei and online analysis. There is a danger in that attention. True crime can turn victims into plot devices if it is careless. In this case, the center must remain clear. Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn child were real people, not symbols in a puzzle. The evidence matters because it exposed what happened to them. The cameras matter because they helped break a false story. The timeline matters because it forced accountability. The doorbell camera did not deliver justice by itself. The oil site did not explain motive by itself. The interrogation did not repair the harm. The guilty plea did not restore the family. But each piece carried the case away from speculation and toward consequence. That is the movement viewers are really watching, not mystery turning into entertainment, but denial being stripped down until only the record remains. If there is one lesson in the Watts case, it is that lies often depend on speed. They need the first few hours to belong to confusion. They need people to accept the easy version before the hard facts are ready. Here, that window narrowed quickly. A friend refused to relax. A neighbor had footage. The house held contradictions. The worksite tied the story to a place. The interview room made the gaps harder to hide. By the end, the case was no longer about whether a family had simply vanished. It was about why the simplest explanation had been offered, why it failed, and how ordinary evidence exposed something extraordinary in the worst possible sense. A front porch became a stage, a neighbor's camera became a witness, an oil site became a destination, and a story that began as a missing family plea ended as a record of guilt. That is why the footage still feels cold. It is not dramatic because it shows everything. It is dramatic because it shows just enough. The camera does not know what it is capturing. The street does not know what it is witnessing. The house does not announce what happened inside it. The truth arrives later, and when it does, every ordinary image changes. The Watts case remains one of the clearest examples of how a modern investigation can be shaped by small recordings and fast concern, not because technology replaces detectives, and not because public suspicion is always right, but because real evidence can challenge a story before that story has time to harden. The camera saw a fragment. The neighbor noticed. The investigators pressed. The timeline answered. There is a reason the first day still matters more than many later summaries admit. Later, the facts are arranged cleanly. The plea, the sentence, the case file, the declinations, the headlines. But the first day did not have that order. It had people standing in a house trying to decide whether to be polite or alarmed. It had a friend who knew the silence was wrong. It had an officer walking through rooms where nothing was obvious enough to end the uncertainty, but enough was wrong to keep the concern alive. That uncertainty is what makes the footage so uncomfortable. The viewer knows where the case is going. The people in the frame do not. They are still inside the doorway between possibility and confirmation. The house looks like it might surrender a harmless explanation at any moment. Maybe there is a note. Maybe there is a missed message. Maybe the family is somewhere else. But every ordinary object seems to answer with a colder kind of silence. The car seats matter because they belong to routine. The phone matters because it belongs to connection. The purse matters because it belongs to movement. None of these objects is dramatic by itself, but together they form a pattern of interruption. A mother might leave in anger, but why leave without the things that make leaving possible? A spontaneous trip might explain absence, but it does not explain the stillness inside the house. The objects do not accuse anyone. They simply refuse to support the easiest story. That is why the camera footage lands so hard. It gives the investigation a fixed point while everything else is still emotionally unstable. People can misunderstand tone. People can misread shock. People can forgive a strange pause because grief behaves strangely. A camera is not wise, but it is stubborn. It records what enters the frame and what leaves it. Once that fixed point is available, the story has to fit around it, and Chris Watts' story kept getting smaller. The neighbor's living room became an accidental choke point. It was not a courtroom, but it carried a courtroom's energy for a few minutes. Someone watching, someone explaining, and a silent image doing more damage than any argument. That is the strange power of surveillance evidence. It often looks boring until the timeline around it changes. Then the boring image becomes the most important image in the room. The same is true of the work truck. A truck is not suspicious because it exists. A worker leaving early is not automatically suspicious. What matters is its combination. The missing family, the items left behind, the timing, the driveway, the route, the explanations, and the later destination. In isolation, many facts can look ordinary. In sequence, they begin to behave like a map. The oil site gave that map a destination. It moved the investigation away from speculation and into geography. A route can be checked. A job site can be searched. A timeline can be compared against work records and physical movement. That is why the industrial setting feels so cold in this case. It is not only remote, it is practical. It is a place that turns a lie into logistics. By the time the case reached sentencing, the public had already seen enough fragments to understand why the first version failed. The legal process named the crime and imposed punishment, but the public memory had been shaped earlier by images. The porch, the garage, the neighbor's screen, the interview room, the tanks. Those images remain because they show how ordinary surfaces can hide extraordinary violence until evidence pulls the surface apart. There is also a warning in the way the case was consumed. The footage is powerful, but it is not a game. The victims were not clues placed for an audience. Shanna and Watts, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn child were the center of the loss. Every camera angle and every timeline detail matters only because it helped expose what happened to them. Without that moral center, the case becomes spectacle. With it, the evidence becomes accountability. So when people return to this case, the question should not be only how Chris Watts lied. It should be why the lie had any space to breathe at all. It had space because the first hours of any crisis are messy. People want to believe the safest explanation. They do not want the husband on the porch to be the suspect. They do not want a family home to be a crime scene. The evidence had to make the comfortable answer impossible. That is the real structure of the Watts case. Comfort being removed, one fact at a time. The silence removed comfort. The belongings removed comfort. The footage removed comfort. The interview removed comfort. The oil site removed comfort. The guilty plea removed any remaining legal uncertainty. What was left was not a mystery with a clever ending, but a record of how quickly a false story can collapse when ordinary people, ordinary cameras, and ordinary objects are taken seriously. And once the timeline answered, the first version could not survive. The final pressure point is easy to miss because it looks so ordinary. No single image in the early record announces the whole truth. The driveway only shows movement. The house only shows absence. The neighbor's screen only shows a slice of time. The worksite only shows a place on a map. But an investigation does not need one image to explain everything. It needs each image to remove one excuse, until the person telling the story has nowhere left to stand. That is what happened here. The first excuse needed the family to be elsewhere by choice. The belongings pushed back. It needed the morning to be unclear. The camera pushed back. It needed the workday to feel routine. The route and the oil site pushed back. It needed the public interview to sound like concern. The interview room pushed back harder. By the time the record was assembled, the story had not merely changed, it had been cornered. This is also why the case still works as a lesson in restraint. The most important early evidence was not loud. It did not arrive with a confession. It did not require a dramatic discovery in the first minute. It arrived as small practical facts: who called, who answered, what stayed behind, what the camera saw, where the truck went, and which explanation kept shrinking as those facts accumulated. Suspense in this case comes from patience. The facts do not scream. They wait. For Shenan, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn child, the legal ending can never balance the human loss. A sentence can answer responsibility, but it cannot repair the mourning. What the record can do is preserve the truth against the easier story that was offered first. It can show how concern became urgency, how urgency became evidence, and how evidence became consequence. So the coldness of the Watts case is not only in the crime itself, it is in the way ordinary life kept recording around it. A door camera kept its silent frame. A neighbor kept his footage. A friend kept pressing. Investigators kept testing each answer against the physical world. And piece by piece, the ordinary world refused to protect the lie.